So what I'd like to do today is to continue talking about classical social theorists. Last time I talked about Marx, and this time I will talk about Weber. And after that, I will then go on to talk about more recent trends in trying to make sense of the larger changes in these statements. So Max Weber, of course, is along with Karl Marx one of the two great social theorists of 19th and 20th century Europe. He began as a jurist, meaning a legal scholar, but of course he, being a good German scholar, had to do two dissertations, and his second dissertation was on Roman agrarian history. He marries Marianne Schnittger, the woman here, who becomes something of a pioneering scholar of feminism in Germany. This is probably the picture that's most used for Max Weber. It's exceedingly severe, as I'm sure he was. He didn't smile when he lectured, as he will do these days. One of the more interesting things is, of course, because social theory was not really established, Weber went to work in many different fields, obviously in legal studies, but also in what today we would call economic history. And yet he did many things that today's sociologists would recognize as deeply sociological. He did a very extensive survey of Polish workers engaged in what we would call agrarian or industrial sociology. But his very impressive academic career takes a major turn when he has a nervous breakdown around 1897. He goes into a very deep depression, and many people speculate that this was sexual in nature, in part because we know, for various reasons, that he never had sex with his wife. But be that as it may, it is true that for about 6 years he didn't do anything, basically stared out the window. But he comes back with probably what has come to be his most famous piece of writing, the Protestant Ethic essay, and goes on to write many more books. He was also, like many scholars, quite active politically, even though some people like to categorize him as a kind of a conservative nationalist. It's actually more fair to say he was left of center nationalist. He then goes and gets chairs at University of Vienna and then University of Munich, where he dies in 1920. Looking back over his vast oeuvre, what's most impressive is just the sheer range of topics he covers. The bits you would have to read largely have to do with comparative historical study of religion. However, not only did he cover the major world religions, not just Judaism and of course Christianity, but religions of China and India. He made fundamental contribution to our understanding of what today we would call political economy or economic history, most obviously in a book that's translated to English as General Economic History, and his kind of mammoth encyclopedia called Economy and Society. He wrote a great deal on methodology, and even what we would probably call philosophy. And what's probably less known is that he actually wrote a great deal about what was going on in the world at the time, not just about his native Germany, about which he wrote a great deal on social policy, but also on the Russian Revolution, one of the most consequential events in early 20th century world history. In fact, he wrote so much that he even wrote a very impressive piece on the sociology of music. In trying to understand Weber, I think it's very often useful in reading a social theorist to ask the question Hannah Arendt asked, which is to say, what was he afraid of? usually when you try to grapple with a philosopher or social theorist, we try to simply figure out what he or she liked or loved. But in many ways, it's actually quite illuminating to think about what Weber in this case and other philosophers were afraid of. And essentially it comes down to what he wanted to argue against or did not want to fall into the trap of believing in. So the most important, I think, is conservative social theory that was probably dominant in Germany at the time. What made this conservatism is that it had a very strong philosophical core. It believed in the social body politics, as kind of an organism, almost like a human being. And it's a human being that was powered largely by ideas. So it was at once idealist and organicist, believing that social life or society was held together by a set of ideas or principles, like the human body. At the same time, of course, he was extremely cautious and skeptical about Marxism, which many of his students were interested in. Essentially, his colleagues were conservatives. His students were being attracted by Marxism. And obviously what Weber did was largely to try to provide an alternative to Marxist understanding of capitalism, the state, and the like. And in particular, even as much as he was against idealism that was popular in German academic life at the time, Weber was also troubled by the scandal of materialism. He really wanted to believe that it's not simply material interests, largely class interests, that drive history, but rather that ideas can have a role in shaping world history. The final bit, which I think is actually even more important in many ways, is that he was deeply attracted to, but also was very skeptical about the idea of Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher. In particular, one of the ways in which the main theme in Weber's philosophy, in some ways, is rationalization. The world is increasingly becoming dominated by instrumental rationality. Instrumental rationality as essentially a way of understanding the calculus of means and ends. Given the ends you want to pursue, it's all about which means you choose. And he, though, was influenced by Nietzsche in part because more than anyone else, Nietzsche announced the end or the loss of meaning in Western civilization, largely with his pronouncement that God is dead, that Christianity no longer provides the foundation for worldview. And so they wanted to come up with something that would make better sense, that meanings certainly have a place even in the disenchanted world of early 20th century Europe. So the Protestant Ethic essay, which is probably the single best read piece still in social theory, becomes essentially an introduction to his comparative historical sociology of world religions. What's interesting about the Protestant Ethic essay, from my perspective, is that it seems to invite serious misreadings. Most people today take the essay to simply mean that culture or religion has an important role to play in general. In fact, Weber asks nothing of the sort. And indeed, at the end of the essay, he says that he's not trying to come up with a one-sided interpretation or explanation of world history. He's simply trying to say that at a certain time and place, ideas and meanings can have a huge impact. But by and large, if you read his general economic history, you'll see that he's not that different from Marx. He's largely interested in class interests, material interests. He certainly talks more about the state, about the importance of accounting and other business techniques. But by and large, it's not that he was so anti-Marxist. Rather, he was trying to show that it's not always materialism. The final point I think I'd like to stress is that the essay actually is profoundly anti-sociological. I think sociology has, by and large, come to have one dominant way of understanding the world, and it's a form of what I will call structuralism. Essentially, that there are independent variables, which one might call structural variables. And they come to explain dependent variables, whatever that may be. You might be interested in income inequality, you might be interested in mobility, these are dependent variables. You might be interested in health outcomes, you might be interested in how often, say, certain groups of people get married. But the key explanatory variable in sociology is always structural variables such as class, could be status, could be gender, could be ethnicity, could be nation, could be any number of things. But that these structural variables explain or account for these dependent variables. And that's really the dominant way in which sociology has developed, not just in the US, but Europe and Asia in the last 50 years or so, and even before that. What Weber provides is a profoundly anti-sociological understanding. That ideas, certain religious people think in a certain way about how salvation works should have such a huge repercussion and consequence for outcome in terms of world history. But the main reason I think, though, he's read in some way is that sociologists, in coming up with structuralism, had become very bad at explaining social change. There's a sociological penchant, there's a temptation to want to explain why things stay the same. They want to explain why there's stability, why there's reproduction of class inequality, gender inequality, ethnic racial inequality. Essentially, sociologists have created a science of explaining why things don't change, why there's stability. And this is actually true even if you're a leftist, Marxists, like Pierre Bourdieu. A lot of the sociology is trying to explain why there's reproduction, why there's class inequality that persists over time, educational inequality, so on and on. So sociologists are not good at explaining change, and what Weber provides, for lack of anything better, is that it's actually a way to explain change. That ideas, randomly though it may be, and even irrationally, can erupt in the world, can have an impact in the world. And one might even say he might be kind of a precursor of chaos or complexity theory, which I'll talk more about later. However, what's interesting is that having explained this massive change, this major turning point in European history and world history as a consequence, much of his energy later on was spent trying to tame this radical insight. That he wants to kind of put a lid on the random eruptions of ideas and meanings infusing into the world. So if you read Sociology of Religion, which you read just a bit of, and the comparative analysis of world religions, it's very, very impressive because he, of course, talks about all the major world religions. He was now the first social theorist really to talk knowledgeably about Asia, India, and China in particular. But his explanation essentially pushes the source of difference to essentially 2,000 years ago, what later Karl Jaspers called the Axenzeit, or Axial age. Axial age is when all the major world religions emerged. As you probably know, if you don't know very much about world history, many of the leading world religions arose sometime around 2,000, 2,500 years ago. And he tries to essentially push back the differences across world cultures to the beginning of these world religions. So in so doing, what he does, of course, is he minimizes later changes, later transformations, because the fundamental track of world history was laid down several thousand years ago. And this leads him to create a theory that's increasingly, in a very funny way, teleological, meaning he simply presupposes a clear given end and is therefore ethnocentric. Let me try to explain why. Because the whole project of world religion comes to the simple question of why is it that it's only in the West something like capitalism arises? So rather than trying to understand world civilizations on their own terms, the whole programmatic turns around the simple question: why wasn't there capitalism or industrial capitalism in other civilizations? So everything is perceived from the standpoint of the West, that of course leads to capitalism. And even though the Protestant ethic provided one solution, I think his general drift was to push back the differences farther and farther back into world history. So this is, of course, has a huge impact in the case of understanding of East Asia among social theorists, because Marx had almost nothing really to say about China or India. Weber becomes the main theorist that people turn to when they try to make sense of East Asia. But again, what's interesting is if you look at efforts by Western scholars to make sense of East Asia, they often end up sharing the Weberian programmatic. Namely, why is it that capitalism or other things associated with European modernity only arises in the West, Europe, and why they don't in Asia? And to the extent that they show up in Asia, they try to look for the same things as happened in Europe. So there's a very famous book written by my recently dead colleague, Robert Bellah, who'll talk about religion. And essentially what Bellah tries to do is to essentially emulate Weber's analysis of the Protestant ethic. But for Japan, because Japan, as you know, was the first non-European society to become industrial, capitalist, modern in some ways. And by and large, this understanding, this way of doing social theory becomes dominant for people who are interested in social theory in East Asia. I will elaborate and tell you more about this later. Okay. So, any questions before I move on? Professor Wu said I must stop after I lecture today. I will stop and give you a 5 or 10 minute break so you can come up with questions. So what impact did social theory have on understanding of East Asia? Well, I want to actually suggest that it had negative and baleful impact of social theory on understanding of non-Western society. And I actually sometimes argue even more strongly that because of that, it had kind of created a wrong understanding of Europe itself. But for the moment, let me just focus on non-Western and in particular East Asia. That it established a long tradition, which we have not shaken out of ethnocentrism or Eurocentrism. The whole programmatic, the whole way in which we pose questions, the way we try to understand non-Western society is from the standpoint of Europe. the main unit of analysis, as I mentioned last time, becomes the nation state. And this becomes the unquestionable unit by which societies are understood, the social world is understood. And third and finally, it brings a commitment to determinism that's probably unwarranted by evidence, namely that it begins to be deeply teleological, meaning it presumes kind of an endpoint, a goal toward which societies are moving. And even more curiously, that this movement is powered or fueled by internal factors, endogenous factors. In Weberian analysis, change happens internally. Changes in the way people are thinking. And in almost all the social theories, these twin elements of determinism play a huge role. That you're moving toward the same end, the predetermined end, and that what's moving it is largely an internal set of factors. And what this means essentially is, from my standpoint, that the promise of social theory, which was supposed to be emancipatory in some way, becomes kind of closed. Right? Because now, even though we, so to speak, assume in social theory that people make their history, right? People create, right, social life and history. It's not given by God or determined by your genes. There's a new kind of historical philosophy, which is largely presumes kind of a track upon which all societies are traveling. So to the extent sometimes countries or nation states shift their path, it's because sometimes there's a switchman, as Weber argued in one of the essays that you read. But that's about the only source of change. You can change tracks. There's a switchman. Ideas act as switchmen sometimes. But by and large, there are these tracks that are laid down. And because societies are like trains, they simply chug along. They move along on these rail tracks. And in this sense, I think it's fair to say that the older tradition of European thinking, of thinking of history as kind of a fake, kind of comes back to haunt and dominate thinking on social theory. For a long time in Europe, of course, as elsewhere, there was really no sense of history as we think of it. Many societies or cultures thought that time moved in a cyclical way, like seasons. And to the extent that they thought things moved in linear fashion, the most famous way in which people thought about history was that it was in decline. You know, there was the Golden Age that leads to the Silver Age, that leads to the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. That things just get worse. But with the rise of industrial capitalism, modernity, whatever you like to call it, everyone begins to believe that this history is linear, but it's progress. Everything gets better. And this progressive, linear history becomes the dominant way to understand history. It's still a single track, but it's getting better. Technology improves, GNP goes up, everything seems to get better. And certainly that is a worldview that's very common today these days. Now, to the extent that there was consensus among social theorists in mid-20th century, it was in the form of the philosophy or social theory of Alfred Parsons, who taught for close to 40 years at Harvard and became kind of a master social theorist at the time of what today we call the American century. It only lasted for about 50 years, but nonetheless. And what Parsons tried to do, as I mentioned 2 lectures ago, was to synthesize the major movements in social theory, most importantly, Weber and Durkheim. And I'm not going to go into great detail, but he tried to envision society as a system, social system, and that it was largely self-reproducing. And so the function of social system was to essentially create a homeostatic system in which things more or less stay the same. And when he was forced to acknowledge that change happens, history occurs, the dominant explanation he gave was in terms of biological differentiation. Just as when organisms, when they grow, they just differentiate. You start from a single cell, but they divide, eventually different parts get specialized. You have your arms and hands, legs and head and so on. The society or social system as it develops becomes increasingly differentiated from a village, if you will, to a large complex society like the United States. But by and large, his social theory emphasized the fact of social stability and order, and largely one of reproduction, which is why if you read Parsonian influenced works, it's really all about socialization. Why do they care so much about socialization? Well, because it's largely the social life creates, if you will, stability. And the way to do that was generally socializing young people to become like adults. This idea gets when it was transplanted into the non-European world, became known as modernization theory. And what modernization theory did was try to understand the rest of the world, what used to be the third world, not the West, sometimes Japan, but usually not, and try to explain how these societies are moving from traditional to modern. And modern was largely Western. So Parsonian theory was kind of transplanted into the third world because obviously the third world countries were not so developed, not like the West. The stress was less on reproduction and more on change, how change occurs, just as Europe once was traditional itself, pre-industrial, pre-modern. They tried to use that understanding, so Galton theorists like Kuhnius, to explain how similar changes must occur in non-Western societies. Now, what's kind of interesting, of course, is that even as people try to formulate and formalize modernization theory, people start criticizing it almost immediately. I mean, that is to say, because the perspective was so obviously Western, almost everyone in social cultural anthropology who began to study other cultures began to take seriously the idea of cultural relativism, meaning that it's not that useful to understand other cultures from the standpoint of the West, say US or UK, but they needed to be understood in their own terms. But beyond that, there was the problem of what anthropologists used to call the problem of going naked. That once you begin to understand different cultures on their own terms, then they begin to see that it's hard to say why this culture is any worse, any less developed than the culture from which you came. Of course, you could say in terms of technology, it's behind, the economy is not so developed, whatever, but by and large, there was this amazing shift, striking shift in people's consciousness of people who were studying other societies, that perhaps not only were they different, right, but that difference was not a matter of one being worse or better than the other. They're just different. And this, of course, kind of permeates area studies well, not just anthropology. And over time, it becomes kind of crystallized in Edward Said's critique of Orientalism. That Bert Said wrote a book called Orientalism in 1975 or so, in which he criticized the European discourses on what we call the Near East or the Middle East, essentially saying that taking kind of an ethnocentric perspective, it looked down on and made the Orient